In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy arrived in Japan. His mission was simple: open the country to trade with the U.S. by any means necessary. For the past 250 years, the Tokugawa shogunate had ruled the islands of the rising sun, and under its brutally strict martial laws, the country had barred all outsiders, save a few Dutch traders, from entering or doing business. Perry was determined to accomplish his mission, and with a fleet of powerful warships at his back, the shogunate quickly acquiesced. Change followed, and with the Meiji Restoration, Japan was on its way to becoming a modern industrialized nation. The Japanese then looked to the British for inspiration. At the time, Queen Victoria ruled over one of the largest empires in human history, all from what was the relatively small base of the British Isles. Unsurprisingly, the Japanese saw Britain as a role model for success, being a collection of islands themselves. The Imperial Japanese Navy was born following Royal Navy traditions, and Japan tried to draw upon as much of the latter's experience as was possible. British shipyards built Japan's early fleets of warships, while the home islands raced to catch up industrially. After success in the First Sino-Japanese War and the later Russo-Japanese War, the Empire of Japan had firmly made its first steps onto the world stage, and was well on its way to becoming a great power. Following the Royal Navy, the Japanese recognized building up a fleet of warships would be critical not only to their defense, but also to their expansion. Further backing this theory was Mahan's revolutionary work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, which corroborated this thinking. When Japan went to war with China in the First Sino-Japanese War, the Imperial Navy distinguished itself at the Battle of the Yalu River, winning a decisive victory against the Chinese forces. Vindicated in their belief that the sea was the secret to success, Japan continued its naval buildup. By 1904, their navy was small but powerful, with British-built battleships like IJN Mikasa being some of the most lethal in the world. It was then that Japan would go to war with the Russian Empire over a land dispute on the Korean peninsula. Defeating their Pacific forces in a surprise torpedo attack before the war had been officially declared, the Japanese had set the tone for the conflict. When Admiral Rossesvinsky finished his marathon voyage from the Baltic Sea all the way to the Straits of Tsushima, he was met by the battle-hardened admiral of the Japanese combined fleet, Togo Heihachiro. Togo was an extremely skilled naval officer, and having had time to drill and prepare for the Russian admiral's arrival, he hopelessly outclassed his opponent, notwithstanding other problems within the Russian fleet. Winning yet another decisive victory at the Battle of Tsushima that brought an end to the war, Japan had been fully convinced by this point that their navy was to be the backbone of their empire. Being firmly loyal to the British, the Japanese benefited often from advancements in technology in the Royal Navy, as shipyards in Britain supplied Japan with her warships. As such, Japan had seen that an all-big-gun battleship was not long in coming, and had tried to be one of the first to create one in the Satsuma class. However, these ships would not be completed with their originally planned armament of 12 12-inch guns due to a shortage of the weapon, and thus they were only semi-dreadnoughts. They did have the distinction of being the first battleships built in Japan, albeit with mostly imported parts. With the advent of HMS Dreadnought, the Japanese knew their next design had to have a unified main battery. While the ships would incorporate 12 12-inch guns, the Navy made a critical mistake in only arming the forward and aft turrets with the 12-inch 50 caliber gun, while the other four were armed with the 45 caliber version of that weapon. This resulted in the ships having a technically non-unified main battery, which was problematic as it would be difficult to distinguish the fall of shot between the two sets of guns so that necessary adjustments could be made in targeting. These 12-inch guns were unfortunately also laid out in a similar hexagonal manner to the Nassau class, which added an ungainly amount of extra weight for only an 8-gun broadside. The secondary and tertiary battery were made up of 10 6-inch and 8 4.7-inch guns respectively, with 8 12-pounder 3-inch guns and 5 submerged torpedo tubes completing the armament. The ships would displace around 21,000 tons normal load and would be well protected. Their main belt of armor ranged from 5 to 12 inches thick, with a 1.2-inch thick armored deck. 11 inches of barbette and turret armor shielded the primary armaments, and 10 inches of protection on the conning tower rounded out the armor scheme. One of the best aspects of this class could be found in the propulsion. Like the Italians, they were quick to follow the British and adopt the steam turbine engine, which propelled two shafts to a design speed of 21 knots, though this was exceeded in service. The Kawachi class were ordered in 1907 as part of the beginning of the 8-8 Fleet Plan, a plan which called for 8 battleships and 8 armored cruisers to be built, although the latter would be modified to become battle with the advent of HMS Invincible. 2 ships were built, IJN Kawachi and IJN Setsu. Kawachi would be launched in 1910, with Setsu going down the slipway early the following year. Both were completed in 1912, by which point they were outclassed by more recent entries in the Dreadnought type, but they were still powerful, particularly in that there was no ship in their immediate area of the Pacific that could match them. During the First World War, Japan would enter on the side of the British, and the Kawachi class would bombard German fortifications at the Siege of Tsingtao in late 1914. Neither would see much action for the duration of the conflict, and Kawachi would be sunk in an accidental magazine explosion on the 12th of July, 1918, somewhat eerily just over a year after the British lost HMS Vanguard to a similar explosion. After the war, Setsu was ordered to be disarmed, with the Washington Naval Conference placing limitations on the number of battleships nations could have, and she was subsequently converted into a target ship, being given extra armor and later radio control to allow her to further withstand hits and maneuver without endangering a crew. She then saw service transporting a battalion of Japanese soldiers to Shanghai at the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. When the Kido Butai set sail for Pearl Harbor, Setsu, interestingly, was used to simulate radio traffic between 8 aircraft carriers in effort to deceive the Americans as to the location of the Imperial flat tops. Serving once again as a target for carrier pilots in training, she would finally be sunk at anchor by a U.S. naval air raid in 1945, finally being broken up where she lay after the war. Overall, the Kawachi class represented a middle-of-the-road entry in the pantheon of early dreadnoughts. They were able to exploit the technological advantage of steam turbine engines and were well protected. However, the insistence that the ships be built in Japan, whose shipyards were still not quite ready for the task, resulted in some of the design problems that would not have occurred had the ships been built in Britain, such as the mixed main battery or the hexagonal turret layout. While they weren't perfect, they did represent the rise of the Imperial Japanese Navy and its determination to become a first-rate naval power. Thank you so much for watching. If you have a suggestion for a future video, please leave it in the comments below.